Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to webinar Agenda 21, Practical Significance of the Dasgupta Review, a conversation with Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta. I'm Vinod Mathur, presently working as the chairperson of the National Biodiversity Authority of India. Prior to that, I worked for over 3 decades at the Wildlife Institute of India. And recently, I've been spearheading India's initiatives for mainstreaming biodiversity in key sectors and policy mechanisms. I also serve as the UN CBD and the UN IBIS Bureau member, largely looking at the promotion of research policy interface. Now, we all know that a healthy planet underpins a healthy economy. With this mission, the United Kingdom Treasury requested Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta to conduct an independent review to cover 3 important tasks. A, to assess the economic benefits of biodiversity globally. B, assess the economic costs and risk of biodiversity loss. And importantly, identify a range of actions that can simultaneously enhance biodiversity and deliver economic prosperity. All 3 indeed being very significant and interrelated tasks. In this context, I would like to add that there have been 2 recent scientific documentation, the IBIS Global Biodiversity Assessment Report and the WWF Living Planet Index Report. And these have provided irrefutable evidence of rapidly increasing biodiversity loss. And they have also underscored the need that we must act urgently if we are to avoid both the environmental and economic risks that arise from the continued degradation of the natural environment. And we need to ensure that we are best placed to take advantage of the benefits of a nature-positive future. Although I strongly believe that our esteemed guest for today's webinar, who is joining us live from the United Kingdom, needs no formal introduction, it is both an honor and privilege for me to welcome him on behalf of the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Government of India, and to introduce him. Thank you, sir, for finding time to be with us and to participate in this interactive session. Sir Partha Dasgupta is the Frank Ramsay Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Cambridge, United Kingdom. He is also a Fellow of the Royal Society and Fellow of the British Academy. His research interests have covered welfare and development economics, the economics of technological change, population, environmental and resource economics, social capital, the theory of games, and importantly, the economics of global warming and the economics of malnutrition. Interestingly, while I was going through the CV of our distinguished guest, I came across a little description of his research style. And in his own words, I quote, "My ideas develop gradually. I chase a problem, and in the process of solving it, I observe something else and move in a slightly different direction. So I look back from time to time to see if the ideas I have been considering are related to one another and might be trying to send me a message." Unquote. So that's how, or there's one more line, that's what has happened to me. I never had a grand plan, but results accumulate little by little. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel that this is probably one of the many reasons for his remarkable achievements in professional life and for his original and influential work in the field of environmental economics. Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta was awarded the prestigious Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement in 2016. Many in the audience today certainly have an idea of the recently released landmark report, The Economics of Biodiversity, the Dasgupta Review, that places biodiversity at its core and calls for changes in how we think, how we act, how we measure economic success to protect and enhance our prosperity and the natural world. Grounded in a deep understanding of ecosystem processes and how they are affected by economic activity, the framework presented in this review sets out how we should account for nature in economics and in decision making. The issues addressed by the review are undoubtedly complex and far-reaching. In addition to the immediate actions set out in this review, there is a need to consider ways in which to integrate further the review's conclusions in order to meet its ambition to deliver a nature-positive future and to ensure that economic and financial decision-making supports that ambition. And this is one of the reasons for organizing this webinar, in which we have a very large number of professionals from different parts of the country and the world who have joined us virtually. I welcome you all. Undoubtedly, the Dasgupta review represents a substantial contribution to our understanding of the urgent global issues of biodiversity loss, and its clear, but I must say often overlooked economic consequences. And that is why we are here today, spending our time and effort to deepen our understanding. I would like to add that we have partnered this webinar with a range of entities, the Ministries of Government of India, the UNDP, the Biodiversity Collaborative, the Yes Bank, and the Campaign for Nature. Many of you would know that Campaign for Nature, launched in October 2018, is a growing coalition of conservation advocates that is working with policymakers and others to commit to a clear and ambitious target to protect at least 30% of land and oceans by 2030, and to mainstream it in the CBD agenda and also in the ongoing discussions on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Beside this, we have experts from NCERT, from Bharatiya Vidyapeeth, from the Indian School of Public Policy and the TERI School of Advanced Studies. They have also joined us, and I welcome you all. With these remarks, I would now like to request Dr. Nandan Non, the professor at the TERI School of Advanced Studies, to kindly moderate this webinar. Many of us know Dr. Nandan as well. He is an economist by disciplinary training and teaches at the interface of economics, development, and environment. And his present research interests are in the areas of economics of ecological restoration. He is also a Fulbright Fellow and was the honorary managing editor of the Ecology, Economy, and Society, the INSEE Journal. With these, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you once again for your time and your presence. And I would like to hand over to Nandan to continue with the webinar. So over to you, Nandan. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the time in which you are in. So without further ado, let me request Ms. B.V. Umadevi to offer her initial remarks. And the remarks will be in the context of an Indian initiative that is soon will become a reality. We all hope for that. That's a national mission for biodiversity and human well-being. Many of you know that this is one of the 9 missions that were agreed upon or proposed by the Prime Minister's Science, Technology and Innovation Advisory Council way back in 2018. And some of the missions, some of the missions of that 9 have already been launched. We all hope to see this. Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change will be the host of that mission. And in that regard, remarks by Ms. Umadevi, who is the additional secretary in the capacity of the biodiversity, will be of great importance to us. Ms. Umadevi is an officer from the 1987 batch of Indian Forest Service from the Chhattisgarh cadre. She has served as an additional principal chief conservator of forest, that is the government of Chhattisgarh, and also assistant inspector general of forest, MOEFCC. She was also the deputy director of Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration, Mussoorie. Over to you, Ms. Umadevi, for your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me first thank the organizer for giving me this opportunity to give my initial remarks on this very important topic of on the practical significance of the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity in the context of the National Mission on for Biodiversity and Human Well-Being. At the outset, I must congratulate Sri Dasgupta for his attempt to bring biodiversity to the core of economic policy making through his report. Biodiversity, as you all know, is the diversity of life on Earth, starting from minute microorganisms to plants and large mammals such as tigers, and last but not the least, the Homo sapiens. And entire humanity has been dependent on biodiversity for time immemorial. Various goods and services such as food, medicines, fibers, the ecosystem services such as the pollination, clean water, clean air, soil formation, etc. and etc. This is an important component of natural capital which needs to be accounted, as these ecosystem services provide food security, public health security, and the human well-being. Protecting biodiversity will not only ensure social, economic, but also environmental well-being for our people. India, with around 2.5% of the global geographical area, with 18% of the global population, human population, as well as 18% of the global livestock, has around 8% of the biodiversity, and it has a huge potential in contributing to our economy. India is also one of the mega biodiverse countries of the world, with around 96,000 animal as well as 46,000 plant species. While the precise economic value of all the ecosystem services provided by biodiversity may not be known, estimates suggest that our forest alone may yield services worth more than ₹1 trillion a year. And as per the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report for 2021, which states that environmental risks continue to threaten the global economy. And the top 5 risks are extreme weather, the climate action failure, human environmental damage, infectious diseases, and biodiversity loss. While Professor Dasgupta review puts biodiversity at the core of human development and lays framework for preservation and protection of biodiversity, Ministry of Environment and Forest is in the process of finalizing a comparable framework under the National Mission on Biodiversity and Human Well-Being, one of the missions launched by the Prime Minister's Science and Technology and Innovation Advisory Council. The main objective of this mission is to restore and enhance biodiversity, strengthen its sustainable use, generate thousands of green jobs by linking conservation with tangible human well-being outcomes, and maintaining biodiversity in all development programs. Mission has 2 major components. Firstly, cataloging and mapping India's biodiversity by documenting and building the inventory, which will help in monitoring the changes in biodiversity and ecosystem services and assessing potential of the ecosystem services towards contribution to the economy. The second component is divided into 6 programs, which will focus on biodiversity with regard to ecosystem services, climate change and disaster risk reduction, agriculture, health, bioeconomy, and capacity building and outreach. The Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services program will focus on identifying, quantifying, and mapping key ecosystem services such as pollination, food production, water availability, soil fertility, and others in different habitats such as forests, grasslands, rivers, etc. The Biodiversity, Climate Change, and Disaster Risk Reduction Program will map and quantify the role of India's forest in regulating monsoonal rains and mitigating climate change. The Biodiversity and Agriculture Program, which is a very important program with tangible outcomes, aims to measure the economic value of India's biodiversity and ecosystems to ensure countries' food security. It will focus on how biodiversity can enhance agricultural productivity and rural incomes by sustainable use of local ecosystems. This will directly impact the livelihoods of the people dependent on agriculture. The next program is a very important program, the Biodiversity and the Health program, especially in the context of the current pandemic situation. And it will look into two important aspects of how biodiversity can improve healthcare. First one will create an interactive citizens portal to provide reliable information and traditional knowledge related to medicinal plants of India. The second aspect will investigate the relationships between the biodiversity loss and the patterns of infectious diseases that spread through humans from animals, so-called the zoonotic diseases, through an integrated approach linking all relevant departments, such as the Public Health Department, the Forest, Wildlife, Veterinary Department, to proactively control the spread of zoonotic diseases. The next program is the Biodiversity and Bioeconomy program, which will explore the ways to reduce ecosystem stress caused by economic drivers. This program will look for the ways to reduce carbon emissions and effective use of bioresources for renewable and sustainable livelihoods for people. Last but not the least, the biodiversity capacity building and outreach program will work to develop educational and training programs for biodiversity professionals, support existing and develop new citizen science initiatives, and bring biodiversity into public consciousness. To conclude, the mission's efforts will empower India to restore and even increase our natural assets by millions of crores of rupees. It will help in rejuvenating the agricultural production systems and increase rural incomes from biodiversity-based agriculture. It will also result in creating millions of green jobs and restoration and nature tourism. For instance, the restoration activities across India's degraded land alone could generate several million jobs. And more importantly, it has the potential to curtail future pandemics, since the mission encompasses health program, integrating human health with animal, plant, and soil and environmental health. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. We will now move to the 3 sessions that we have planned. The first one will be on environmental education. The second one will be on the use of wealth accounts, and the last one will be on practice of economics and finance with nature and as its core. Now, before we get on to those sessions, a brief recap of why we have chosen those 3. This is on your screen, you can see a diagram which is taken from the Dasgupta review, and it summarizes the different options for change. We at the organizers, we try to look at what would be the different practices that has taken place already in India in terms of different developments at the policy level or even on the ground. In that regard, we identified the 3 with a purple circle. The 3 I read out from this particular diagram. The first, it is adopt inclusive wealth as our measure of success. The second, reform education and accounting to reflect the role of nature. The last, a global finance system that supports nature. In that regard, we will be now requesting first Professor Dasgupta to offer few initial remarks as to how he envisaged or his team envisaged these practices or the options for change. Over to you, Professor Dasgupta.
Thank you very much. And it really is a great honor to be with you. Thank you very much, Dr. Mathur, for your remarks, and to Mr. Umadevi for her very, very clear account of the measures that are being taken. So, Nandan, you asked me to speak to the review, and instead of describing it, a content, because you already have outlined it here, I want to give you something like the background of how I came to write it in the way I did. When I say I, of course, I had a wonderful team that the Treasury offered, made available to me. It's a collaborative venture, extremely hardworking, very intelligent, and most important, extremely questioning of every intellectual move I made, because I was making some serious moves here. Okay, so it's a global review, and I'm going to essentially look at the global side of the review aspect of the review, because the local ones are presumably the topic of discussion in this conference, the local being India. Well, it's not local, but it's pretty sizable, but still, it's we're looking at a particular context. When I began preparing the review, I had no doubt I would do it, by the way, because in some sense I've been working towards it for the last 30, 40 years. But at that time, of course, I haven't crystallized it in a form that could be called the Economics of Biodiversity. Pretty quickly, I realized that the review is not going to be on biodiversity. Biodiversity is a characteristic of ecosystems. And really, what I wanted to do was to build an economics of the biosphere, as large a subject as a social scientist has the privilege of studying. It's a tall order, but the appeal of it is that it's correct. We should regard ecosystems as capital assets, and the fact that we don't needs explanation, and the review goes into it at great length, and the price we are paying for not doing so. So it's the characteristic of ecosystems that we are studying at the end of the day, but it's the productivity of ecosystems that drives the engine of the book. Now, pretty quickly I realized that initially I had thought that I'll be developing environmental and resource economics as has been developed over the past 20, 30 years, and perhaps I'll add a bit to it. But pretty quickly I realized that that would be it would not be correct, because the ambition should be higher, larger. And here is why. The received economics of environmental economics and the resource economics, including the economics of climate change, in a deep sense regards nature to be external to the human economy. Conventional models, received models of growth and development, and the economics of poverty, in large measure ignores nature, in very large measure. And that's the first point I want to make, because I realized that that really has to be changed. Economics of poverty in particular, it's really quite remarkable to me that it just seems to have had a dynamics of its own in which nature doesn't play a role. Now, when I say the economics of poverty, I mean the received economics of poverty. There's plenty of very good work done by environmental economists or ecological economists more on this on extreme poverty in rural areas. I'm talking about the received or mainstream, if you like, the ones that show up in economics journals. So when I say that the human economy is embedded in the biosphere as opposed to being external, which is what the review does, it really means that you cannot avoid talking about natural capital, no matter what kind of policy decision you're involved, or trying to understand any economic activity. There is an intuition of the average person, the citizen, that there is something quite wrong about going for GDP growth, even without any acknowledgement of what that growth process might be doing to a fundamental part of our portfolio of assets, namely ecosystems. And up to very recently, such a person would be argued down by economists by saying, well, you don't understand the bottom line. Or how do you measure it? And if you can't measure it, then of course, the implicit assumption is you place a value of 0 to it, which is an extraordinary move, by the way, when you think about it. Okay. So I had, of course, I should say that I quickly realized that I was not writing the review for the Chancellor of the Exchequer, even although it was he who had asked me to do it. What I was trying to do and I have done it, I believe, I like to think I've done it reasonably well, addressing the concerned citizen. It's she whom I'm addressing. I'm not addressing government officials, because the pressure to change our practices and alter institutions will come from the voter, from the public. It won't come from academic economists, that's for sure, because they have a long way to go before understanding what's going on. So it's to the citizen. And I did that very consciously, and the full review is over 600 pages long, because of course I have to match mainstream growth and development economics and the economics of poverty in terms of rigor and empirical support. I can't simply wave my hands. So that's how it's about 600 pages long, with technical appendices, with tables and so forth. I mean, boxes which have the mathematics in it, because it has to match that grammar. Okay, but then I added a 100-page, I wouldn't say synopsis, but a non-technical account. But that's really addressing the citizen. Okay, her intuition is correct, but she needs a grammar. So the main thing about the review is that it offers a grammar for economics, an alternative to the mainstream that's there, because there's a big hole out there. And you can't simply bring, when you choose, a bit of nature into a conventional model and then take it off when you don't want it. And that's what happened to the economics of climate change, as it's now received. Because the climate model is built onto a model which has no other function relative to nature. And climate regulation is, of course, only one service that Mother Nature offers us. There are dozens of others. Okay, the earth scientists talk about 9 planetary boundaries, for example. And that's, of course, an extremely aggregate view. There is pollination, there is nitrogen fixation, there's decomposition of waste, which we constantly forget, that what we produce, we then have to feed back. And then Mother Nature has to do something with it. And the rhythm of nature is disturbed by our human activities. Okay, so that's one thing. This is the grammar, common grammar. But on the other hand, there's another aspect of the review, which I'd like you to bear in mind, or I hope my readers recognize it, is that no two people experience nature the same way. A farmer in Madhya Pradesh views nature through his or her immediate experiences very differently from you, Nandan, who lives in the metropolis and has an intellectual interest in the problem. And is very different from somebody who lives in the Amazon rainforest, and very different from somebody who's a fisherman in Kerala. So I needed, in that same grammar, I needed a vocabulary large enough for anyone to enter, whether it's a government official, whether it's a fisherman, whether it's you name it. And the vocabulary will be different because the concerns will be different. But they must hang together, and that's why a common grammar is needed. So that's the background of the review, and I will stop now because then you can ask questions regarding the contents and the recommendations. The recommendations are pretty straightforward. They follow directly from the fact that Mother Nature is underpriced for a variety of reasons. And the first part of your webinar is on education. And the review ends with a plea for educational reform starting from primary school onwards, okay? Especially in the context of a growing urban world. But for our purposes here, I'd like to emphasize the re-education needed by the economics profession.
Right, Professor
Thank you very
Dasgupta.
much.
Thank you. Thank you. In fact, I was reminded of your Economics of Nature and Nature of Economics paper in EPW, and that was the first entry, I would say, for the ARM teacher and researcher, or the ordinary teacher and researcher in India, especially who may not have seen environmental economics. And that was the first paper, I would say, in EPW. And
thank you.
And we are going to come back to this, both this matter of environmental education, what we have done, and also how our system of teaching of economics that is needs changes, and so on and so forth. We will now enter into the first session. On the slide, on the slide, you can see a particular text which has been taken up from Dasgupta review, and it emphasizes on matters like affection for nature and its processes. It talks about if we are to take care of nature, we need to serve as judge and jury for our own actions. And in this session, Professor Dasgupta will be in conversation with Dr. C.V. Shimre, who is an associate professor at the Department of Education in Science and Mathematics, National Council of Education, Research and Training in CERT in New Delhi. She is associated with various tasks related to India's school education in general and environmental education in particular. She is the author of Teaching Environmental Education, Trends and Practices in India, published from SAGE in 2016, and has conducted studies on climate change education and implementation of environmental education in the United States. She will be a part of the Chevening Research, Science and Innovation Leadership Fellowship at the University of Oxford this year. With Dr. Shimre, she will be joined by Dr. Iraj Varucha, who is the director of Bharati Vidyapeeth Institute of Environmental Education and Research in Pune. He's a surgeon, environmental educator, wildlife conservationist, photographer, and author. He developed formal curriculum on environment studies for undergraduate courses and has been involved in governance roles with the Bombay Natural History Society, Wildlife Institute of India, World Wildlife Fund for Nature India, and Selim Ali Center for Ornithology and Natural History. Welcome, Dr. Shimre. Welcome, Dr. Bharucha. As a starting point, I would like to ask a question to Dr. Shimre, a warm-up question, and after that, I will once again ask a warm-up question to Dr. Bharucha, and then to Professor Dasgupta, and this is the way we will proceed. Dr. Shimre, you have been part and parcel, or you have been familiar with this environmental education in India as such. You have written a book also. So if I may ask you that among the various interventions by the state so far, UGC or otherwise, on environmental education, which one do you think was most well received and effective? Now, definition of effective is something you can construe on your own. And what do you think would be the reason? The context behind this is that we all in India, environmental education has a history. And the Dasgupta review articulates the need for environmental education. We would like to check that what we have done, that is there a need for course correction, or is there some plus points that we can do? Over to you, Dr. Shimre.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Non. First of all, I thank the organizers for having me. It's such an honor to be part of this webinar. And I would like to congratulate Professor Sarthi Dasgupta and his team for this very comprehensive review on biodiversity and economics. And I especially appreciate that the review, recommended reform in education and specifically on environmental education. So that's something which I really like about this review. Coming to your question, which intervention which I think was most well received. Before I get into that answer exactly, let me take you a little bit back to what interventions have been happening so far in India. So if we look into the status of environmental education in general, most of us must be aware that environmental education in India is mandatory in all stages of education, schools, colleges, and all professional courses as well. And so this is following the order of the Honorable Supreme Court. And so we have compulsory environmental studies courses in the higher education under the UGC. Then for school education, we have this infusion approach, which we call it. That means that we have infused or integrated environmental concepts and concerns in different subjects, in different classes, but throughout from class 1 till class 12. So that's what we have been doing. So one, we have infused whatever we thought was important in different subjects and in different classes. And another aspect or another activity that is taken up as part of environmental education in India in schools is the Eco Clubs program. Eco Clubs, it's like it comes under two, I would say, because one Eco Club that normally happens in any school. Another Eco Club is the program under the National Green Corps program, which is an initiative of the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. So these are the two things, two programs that goes on under Eco Club program. So one is the NGC program and one is just an Eco Club named by the school. And so various students participate in these Eco Clubs. And looking into some of the data, how many schools are involved under the NGC program or Eco Clubs, like it has more than 1 lakh schools, which comes under this NGC program. So more than 1 lakh schools have Eco Clubs in the schools, and about 30 to 50 students are part of that Eco Club. But that sounds staggering, 1 lakh, more than 1 lakh schools. But if we look at the total number of schools in India, like more than 1.3 billion, 13 lakhs, 15 lakhs. So that's not so much. And again, considering that only 30 to 50 students are part of the Eco Clubs, that means that it's not so huge. When education about environment is so important and so critical for everyone. So that is one thing. And there are several activities which are undertaken under this Eco Club. So it's like, you know, observation of internationally or nationally important environmental days. For example, World Environment Day, which has happened, then World Ozone Day, or all kinds of environmentally important days are being observed under this program. Then there are other several activities like, you know, quiz competition or debates or slogan writing competition, poster writing, and tree plantation. You know, it's a huge activity that happens in several schools throughout the country. So these are all these activities in general happens in all these Eco Club schools. So we have, like, as I said, we have the infusion approach where concepts and concerns related to environment are taught in the classroom. Then we have these activities which happens outside the schools under the Eco Club. So these are the major two activities that happens in schools which are implementing environmental education. So if we look into this, it's not very different, you know, and so it's very difficult for me to say that this state has really done well, because almost all the states and almost all the schools under the Eco Club programs are practicing more or less similar activities. So it will not be fair for me to say that, okay, this program really worked well, because we have not really come up with a strategy to measure, you know, how schools are really doing. I mean, how it was implemented. They are doing, that's fine, but how effective that those programs were. So we did not really have a strategy to measure that. We have not developed that yet. And so it's hard for me to tell. But at this point, I would also like to say that there are several environmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, which work with schools. You know, for example, the Center for Environment Education, you have the TERI itself, you have the WWF, you have CSE, Center for Science and Environment. So there are several other NGOs also working with schools so as to create awareness amongst the students. So again, as I said, it's difficult for me to say that this program really worked well. It was very appreciated by everyone. I cannot say that, but yeah, there are certain programs which states have specifically taken up. For example, Delhi government provides some extra fundings, like, you know, besides, I mean, I just mentioned that under this Eco Club, schools do get some, you know, token money, like 5,000 rupees per school annually, which is, I'm sure it's not enough to do all these activities effectively. So besides that, Delhi government do provide some extra grant, like 10,000 per school or college. That's what is being practiced in Delhi. And Uttarakhand is one example that I would like to mention here. They have, besides the regular subjects that they study, they have a textbook called Hamari Dharti Hamara Jeevan. So this is a course or a subject that is studied in class 6, 7, and 8. So there's something in addition to the science and social science. Although it contradicts the National Curriculum Framework 2005 suggestion or recommendation that environmental education should be infused so that the burden on students will not be much, because having additional subject could be a burden. So the whole idea to infuse was to reduce burden as well, because anyway they were going to study about environment in different subjects. It naturally fits in there. So, but still, the more, the better it is, because we really need more students to be aware about what's happening in their local environment, especially. And so Uttarakhand coming up with their own textbook of this kind, Our Land, Our Life, will really, I'm sure that students will have benefited out of this course, understand more of what's happening in the locality, the socio environmental, economic, all those aspects that they're learning about. So I'm sure there are other states also which there's really good programs, but these are some programs that comes to my mind at this point. So yeah, I will leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you. We understand. So thank you for giving us an overview of the environmental education initiatives at the central level, initiated by Supreme Court, and also at the state level. May I now pose a warm-up question to Dr. Bharucha, and in the light of your long association with the environmental studies. So my question to you is that let us assume that environmental studies, or rather it is a fact that environmental studies, environmental education has been in place in India for several decades. Now, if I may provoke you, that what does it produce, or what have it produced? Has it produced really respect for nature among the students, or maybe a fad for green consumption, something like organic products, something like greener things? So in other words, a kind of a sustainable consumption kind of a thing. So I'd like you to respond to that. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Nandan. And thank you, VB and Ravi, for having me for this, because, and it's really a great honor to share this stage with Sir Dasgupta, but also with Simre, who I worked with for the last few years at the NCRT, trying to say, what are the sort of changes we need to do in India? You asked me, Nandan, just now that give my association of last 60 years, but that's only 60 years. And environment education, in a sense, in the non-formal sense, has existed from the Vedic period in India. And you look at what people have written about this, which is something quite incredible, that we knew so much about species and we knew so much about air and water and whatever. And then you had somebody like Ashoka who wrote something that the IUCN does now as a red data list. He had a list of species which are not to be brought to a stable. And then we have those rulers, the Maharajas, who shot an enormous amount of wildlife, but had incredible naturalistic knowledge at the end of this, and actually led some conservation movements eventually, like WWF. So it has passed through many, many stages. The Mughals brought in Persian artists to document our flora and fauna. Super stuff, right? So this is all the background that we have had. And then the British came, and of course they had a very exploitative part of it. They were also shikaris, but they were great naturalists. And incidentally, most of the so-called botanists there were actually surgeons like myself. And this is the background of the non-formal sector, and the NGOs, which then came about, like Bombay Naturalistic Society, which I was part of for many years, WWF, and a whole lot of other organizations. So this is really the background that we already have. So asking me about my 60 years is a very small caucus of what it is. But yes, let's look at those 60 years. I think all this came from non-formal environment education initially, from whatever sectors they were. And yes, we had this very large nature club movement for a long time through WWF. I was part of that. I grew up with that. But then you come to a big transition. And that is when the Anthropocene really comes on. And you start seeing pollution in India. You start seeing water deteriorating. You start seeing your forests going. And then this great lawyer of the Supreme Court, MC Mehta, puts up a court case saying the Taj is getting yellow. And the Supreme Court takes very severe action on this. But he follows that up by saying, what has government done about this? And he says, what are schools and colleges doing? So what is the HR ministry doing? What is the Ministry of Environment and Forest doing? And this brings out a whole lot of changes. Like we were asked at my institute to analyze the environment content of 2,000 government textbooks. It was an enormous project that we had to do. And we identified those gaps that were there in environment education. Coming back a little further down the line, you have Rio coming on and Rio changing this concept of environment education to saying, let's look at education for sustainable development. I think it was a necessary step to look at. Some of these things, both in environment education, which I also participated in, was slightly turn-offs for children, to tell them about the terrible things that were happening in the world was not a very nice way to approach this. And so when we started working at the Bharati Vidyapita on this, I started looking back at myself as a BNHS volunteer and as a WWF volunteer, and found what I had been teaching was taxonomy, telling them the names of the birds you saw in a nature trail or the plants that were there. And I realized that also was a sort of, it wasn't a turnoff. It started off people looking at bird watching, but it didn't do what I thought should happen, which was looking at nature in a much more comprehensive way, looking at the cycles of nature which are there, which you can do by just taking a person in a forest and taking up the detritus and showing what was happening in that detritus. What were those insects doing there? And those kind of linkages that we were able to do. Why is that bird a nectarivore, which has got a huge function in nature? Those were the kind of things that I think we started evolving at our place. We looked at cycles of nature, we looked at environmental services, and the enormous amount of economic benefit from ecosystem services, which is so difficult to quantify for an average school teacher to deal with. And so this is where I come from. So I believe that the time has come for reorienting nature education and doing that with the present ideas of what is ecosystems, what is eco-restoration for a degraded area, where are we taking this and how are we going to take this to children? And this is what I deal with every day for the last several 20, 30 years. And I must tell you, I've had a very full life. I want to remind the audience here that nature is very, very beautiful. And India is not about nature only in national parks and sanctuaries. There are these tiny little hot specks of diversity across our country where you can take children and turn them on. It's beautiful to make them sit quietly in a forest and say, why is it cooler here than outside? And there are so many, many examples of this. And so I was very happy listening to Professor Dasgupta one day on a webinar or on an interview base, because he was echoing those things which I struggled with for so many years. So I'm very happy, sir, to be with you on a panel like this. I'm extremely, extremely honored. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, all of you three, for calling me here. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bharucha, for sharing your rich experience. Now, this is my, I would like to pose a question, a warm-up question before Professor Dasgupta, if I may. Now, given the experience that we have heard from Dr. Shimre and Dr. Bharucha, and your work on the social capital, do you think that it's the social space through which education is imparted, say the environment and the teaching pedagogy through which Krishnamurti Foundation schools operate, rather than just the curriculum that make the students more sensitive to nature, the social space rather than the curriculum? So over to you, Dr. Das.
Wow, that's a difficult question to answer. I'll have a very quick shot at it, but first of all, I should say that I can't improve upon the previous two speakers. So, I mean, it's amazing how their views resonate with my own and is reflected in the review. Nature is very beautiful, and I ended by thinking, suggesting that the only way I know one can develop an affection for an entity is to understand the entity. Try and understand the entity. We'll never get a full understanding. I don't even know what it means. But what you do need is from zero to some idea of the rhythm of life, which is what Dr. Bharucha was rightly focusing on. Yes, the social context matters enormously, but one has to, each person brings with him or her some specific knowledge and expertise and zone of control. So the teacher, per force, has to think about the pedagogy. how to improve it, how to encourage children, as Dr. Barucha very eloquently pointed out, to mess around with nature, fool around with it, dig a little bit and see what's going on in the, in the soils, which are all silent and invisible unless we peer at them. And so we can desecrate it very easily without noting. The social context matters enormously. It is not a surprise that the local ecosystems have been managed on the whole outside the market system, long before markets in the sense we know it developed. We forget that there is a whole history of ecoscience. And they also operate outside the legal system, because the law, as we formally note, isn't there in so much of rural life. And my original critical remarks at my beginning on economics of poverty, received economics of poverty, was directed at that lack of understanding. So how did they do it? So there's tons of literature. There's nothing new here. Anthropologists have been studying it for years and years and years, and a few economists, actually. There are some of the great economists who are not even recognized in India. I have in mind, for example, Dr. Narpad Jodha spent his life working, trying to understand how rural people live in the semi-arid parts of Central India. How did they do it? They did it through what we would today use the expression social norms of behavior. And they are very context specific. Norms of behavior in a coastal region be very different from inside a forest. There's been a great deal of very interesting, rigorous work on using natural experiments as a way of controlling, to show that there's a distinct sense in which local communities are better at managing their ecosystems, local ecosystems, than outsiders. Now, in a sense, of course, it's obvious why it should be so. I mean, we don't, because this is not rocket science. They have been living there for generations, and they have some understanding. They may not have a PhD degree. In fact, they don't have a PhD degree, but they have some understanding of the rhythm of their ecosystem, when not to touch it, when to touch where and how much, and so forth. Okay, and the methods they have used are just amazing. The punishment strategies, the reward system, and so forth. It is not surprising, for example, to me, when you go through West Bengal on a train, I used to go from Calcutta to Shantiniketan to visit my parents. Every village has a pond, and the cottages are all lined up around the pond, and there is no sense of privacy, at least in the sense we believe we ought to have. Question why? Why is privacy not a fundamental right, if you like, in such societies? Well, because observation is extremely important. We need to know who is doing what, because there could be free riding going on. So there are many, many ways in which societies have gently and progressively managed it. So yes, society matters enormously, and to think of society as being households, markets, and the state, which is how received growth and development economics and the economics of poverty have developed, is to miss out the place of social capital, communities, and because that's where the action is. And my review, the middle parts of my review are about that. So yes, you cannot do that without the teaching. The pedagogy really needs to be in part of the rhythm of social life where it is taught, so that it can't be independent of it.
Thank you, Dr. Dasgupta. Dr. Shimre, would you like to pose any question to Professor Dasgupta? Dr. Shimre, you need to unmute yourself. Yeah, please.
Sure, I was thinking, I have so many questions, but I'll stick to a few. Sir, you mentioned in your review, rightly mentioned so, about exposing students to nature, that students are like more or less nature deficit that is there. My question to you is that schools are faced with various challenges in India, in order to expose students to nature. As you mentioned about your focus on the more on the urban areas where schools are just buildings, and beyond that they don't have nothing called nature in that sense. No plants, no animals. It's just concrete that's there around them. So they really have to travel a little bit to be in nature. So for such kinds of exposure, you need, first of all, the problem is with student-teacher ratio. We have many students and very few teachers, and we have lack of facilities like resources, and it's all related to economic status. So in this context, what kind of reform in school education do you suggest for India?
Gosh, it really impertinent on my part even to try it. I'm not, I don't have any direct sense of where you should go. I can only point to ways that can be done in England, which I do know something about, because the urbanness of modern England is, of course, extremely pertinent here. What I think people are trying to do, and that's not the schools, it's more a cooperation with the local councils, the local government, if you like, local councils, and NGOs to create green spaces within the urban framework network. For example, in Cambridge, there is, it's not the biggest urban environment, so it may be an unfair way of thinking, but there are attempts at restoring areas in collaboration with farmers, so that simultaneously with the farmland, restored ecosystems where people can walk and do things. So in creating green spaces would be a way out, which is obvious, in the urban area. Now, again, there's financial constraints, space constraints. I just do not know the Indians. That would be impertinent on my part too. But that's how in other places it's being done. And London has a lot of green spaces now, in addition to the traditional commons that were there. And in principle, students can be taken. However, I should end by saying one distressing piece of news I had was correspondence I had with as it happens, a school teacher of Indian origin in England, who wrote to me after my review was published, saying she was so pleased about the last bit about education, and she was trying to do that in her case. And she was to take children out to the local green space, if you like to do. She was prohibited from doing that because parents didn't like the idea.
I know.
You've got to admit. So what does one do to that? Come on.
Okay. May I request Dr. Bharucha if you want to pose any question to Dr. Dasgupta?
Oh yeah, there's so many. But very briefly, there are two things that have concerned me because I've been doing this for 60 years. And one is to get this nature education so strongly into core educational pedagogy. And there the bug seems to be the policymakers. And how do we sort of get them to do this, Professor Dasgupta, is I think so very crucial. But the other thing that you mentioned, Sajasta, which is extremely relevant to India, we have 10 major biogeographic zones. We have umpteen number of languages. We have forager tribal communities. We have agropastoralists who still have traditional knowledge of agropastoralism. And we have the urban dweller. And these three require totally different approaches to pedagogy for nature conservation. And this has been a permanent struggle of mine. In fact, the schools I work more with and more pleasantly are in the Western Ghats, back out there in the villages. And it's a surprise. The urban teacher who teaches children in these 5-star schools and the teacher who goes in that village Jilla Parishad school are very different people to deal with. So how would you deal with this?
I wouldn't know how you deal with an impossible situation like that. I think that the point you're making is directing us attention to one fundamental truth. There cannot be a universal curriculum. That would be just the wrong thing. It has to be, at least for this, mathematics, yes, you can have universal curriculum in some deep sense, but not ecology. It has to be site-specific. It has to be And I see no reason why, in principle, if you sensitize teachers to those who teach this, who cannot bring the local ecosystem, and when I say local, maybe the provincial or the state, depending on the context, to bear and the kind of citizenry that exists. Now, of course, it is the case that people are mobile. So somebody could object and say, well, look, actually, there are people from another part of the country who are in this school, and they'll be going back. Well, look, you can't solve every problem, but you have to look at center or mass, if you like. And I think the point is exactly right, what you're pointing to, which is it has to be site-specific. It has to be society-specific. And we really forget now in our day of globalization that we are going to homogenize everything. I mean, that's just literally is offensive in some deep sense, because you need a liberal atmosphere for sure. But within that, you really need cultures to thrive. And the link between nature and culture is so powerful, so very powerful, that not to introduce culture, to recognize the salience of culture, I think is really insulting the citizen.
Thank you, sir. This is great for me. This is great for me because it reaffirms what I did with my last two books. One is called Living Bridges, the other is called Changing Landscapes. And that's where I talk about this need for local specificity of how are we going to deal with this? It's just so enormously large. So that's what India is, I guess. We have to live with it.
Most countries are like that, by the way. Yes. I mean, not every country is as large as India, but no matter how small you make it, there will be tensions within it through different experiences.
On that note, we will close this session on environmental education. At least we have identified the challenge, and the challenge is universal, it seems. So we will move to the next session, and the second session is on the wealth accounts. The context of the wealth accounts is dates back, for those of you who may not be familiar with this term, dates back to about 15 years or 16 years, that the World Bank coming up, revisiting the question of the famous question of the wealth of nations, that where is the wealth of nations, the famous title of the book by Adam Smith. And Dasgupta review rightly pointed out that the wealth of nations and not the GDP of nation should be the way through which we should measure. And the context is important for India because, like many other countries, India is also expected to undertake wealth accounting following the system of environmental economic accounting that has been decided by the United Nations Statistical Department. There are different steps that have been taken, but also the fact that in India, there has been another effort towards, I would say, greening of national income accounts. And in fact, Professor Dasgupta chaired that particular committee. 2013, the report came out, greening of Indian national income accounting. There has been efforts in India, and therefore we thought wealth accounting would be our second session, and in which we will be joining by Dr. Pranab Sen, who is the program director of International Growth Center India program and a faculty of Indian School of Public Policy, New Delhi. His research interests cover open economy, macroeconomic systems, international economics, and public finance. He has served as the first chief statistician of India and secretary to the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, and the principal economic advisor, Planning Commission, Government of India, among other responsibilities. Welcome, Dr. Sen. Dr. Sen will be joined by Ms. P. Bhanumati, who is the Deputy Director General as the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, Government of India. In recent years, she has extensively worked on the system of environment economic accounting. She is associated with the publication of ENvisaged India and was project manager on behalf of MOSPI on the National Capital Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services (NCAVS) project in India. She is the chair of the United Nations Statistical Division Working Group constituted for development of macro indicators from the SIA framework. Welcome, Ms. Bhanumati. As a kind of a warm-up question, I would like to pose a question before Ms. Bhanumati, and then I will ask a question to Dr. Sen. Dr. Sen, this is more to do with your experience, and as we have heard in the last session from the experience of Dr. Bharucha as well as Dr. Shimre. And this is to do with the history of green accounting in India. We have seen that we have made some progress, and I am aware of the fact that you have, with your department, has been making enormous progress in terms of, which is very useful to the researcher on the environmental economics, the NCAPES. Annually, you publish it. Now, we understand that there is a data collection in India, especially matters which is environment, which is varied, and there are so many departments, and we have a federal structure. Now, my question to you as a practitioner as to whether this federal structure and the involvement of multiple ministries, is it a handicap, or given the fact that the ecosystem comprises of different sectors, line ministries, the data has to be collected by them. So what is your experience in terms of this challenge, and how do you deal with it? I'm sure you must be dealing with it every day. Okay, over to you, Dr. Ms. Bhanumati.
Thank you, Nandan, for the question. And firstly, thanks to all the organizers who have invited me to this very enriching session. Environmental education, for instance, I had not thought about, so long. I was more worried of the economics part. But now I see the context in which both of them work together. So thank you. And regarding your question, I have personally always found that the more the merrier. So working with many players actually helps you cover more ground. The key here is that these multiple agencies should work together in a way that they are well coordinated. There is no duplication and no redundancy. So the first step, when Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta released his report on greening the national accounts in India, we constituted an interministerial group. Now, this interministerial group, of course, has representation from all areas, all domains, all subject matters. And the best part was that this formal structure of having a group helped interaction between all the players. The group meets twice a year, and this ensures that everyone is aware about the work that is going on. So everyone is able to pitch in. We are able to leverage on the best, knowledge that these different players have, and they also pitch in for framing the plans ahead. So that's essentially what we try to do through this group. So if I could borrow from the Dasgupta review, basically what MOSPI is trying to push is mutual enforcement by bringing these players into our team, rather than using external enforcement as National Statistical Office through one-sided communication. But again, I have to link this to what Dr. Bharucha said. The best linking factor in the Indian context is that for bringing different agencies is that the innate nature, India's innate pro-environment, pro-nature sensibilities. So even though we are challenged by lower per capita income, lower per capita geographical area, forests still account for more than 1/4 of the country. I mean, that's just an example. So let me share an example. MOSPI conducted a forum in January 2021, where we tried to highlight the means and uses of environmental accounting. There was 100% participation in all sessions of the forum by not just all the state governments, but also all the central agencies, which was really remarkable. We had not even expected such a thing to happen in a virtual forum. I mean, people usually log in and log off, but there was 100% participation. People stayed on to listen to all the sessions. So that's something that shows the interest that India does have, even in the formal structure, towards environmental accounting, towards making nature's value visible. Another benefit that I had, or rather we are having because of this, having a federal structure and different type of players, is, because of these differentiated responsibilities, the group or any such collaborative mechanism is not just a combination of jacks of all trades. Rather, we have masters. We have people who have the local level understanding. We have people from Karnataka talking about Karnataka specific issues. So it helps us. It's not about a person from Uttarakhand and thinking that the Western Ghats behave the same way as the forest in Uttarakhand and then having the same rules. So we can bring in this local level expertise when you have a federal structure. So that's something that we have leveraged on and that we have benefited upon. The only problem, I won't even say it's a problem, but a roadblock for now is the availability of well-defined data, well-defined methods and values. Value transfer, for instance, in the national accounts is relatively easier. You don't really struggle a lot with value transfers. But when it comes to environment, every place is different. Every ecosystem is different. We have to, take into several characteristics of quality, of condition, of the spatial connotation, how they are surrounding different ecosystems. I have Professor Dasgupta here when he said that measuring the value of natural capital is notoriously difficult. I mean, take my word, I've been struggling with it for the past 4 years, and his own experience brings in so many years earlier. But that again should not, something that we should stop because of which measurability is purpose incomplete. There's no argument for avoiding measurement. Again, quoting you, I couldn't find a better document to get all the perfect quotes than the Dasgupta review. Thank you so much for this comprehensive document. Coming back to environment accounting, with the CR guidance now being concretized, and we know how do you capture the whats and hows of natural capital accounting. So I do think that very soon we would be seeing an acceleration in the compilation of environmental accounts. Well, that's it from me.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a very, very welcome response. So let me pose a question to Dr. Sen because of his long association with this MOSPI and with the statistical system in India. Now, if we want to arrive at, say, the value of the national capital or assets, we know that we have to use accounting prices, and accounting prices are notoriously difficult. We all are aware of that. And is it, I wonder that whether this accounting prices and this economist obsession of monetization of everything and arriving at the monetary value, could it be the reason for which the biodiversity and ecosystem services or environment as such is still not made integral to the, say, mainstream developmental processes? In other words, we are not being able to speak in the language. Professor Dasgupta referred to the grammar, that we have not been able to develop that grammar so that the mainstream development process would be able to accommodate it. Over to you, Dr. Sen.
You need to unmute.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me preface my answer a little bit because, in a sense, it goes back to 2002, 2003, when we came out with the report on ecological fragility in India. I was put as a chairman because I was an economist, right? And this before Professor Dasgupta had really done his work. And as an economist, I had no answers. But contrary to what Professor Dasgupta said, that in the absence of valuation, we did not put a value of 0. We, in fact, did the exact opposite. We put a value of infinity. We said this cannot be touched. And you have to go to the polars, which then brings me to really the heart of your question. What happens and what do you do when things are much more ambiguous, which is the vast majority of cases? There are obvious areas where I think the evaluation should be at infinity and should stay. But in most areas, that's not the case. And let me tell you what the nature of the problem as we saw it, and as I see it even today, is you can do a valuation, particularly a social valuation, if you're able to forwardcast. If you're not, then there's a problem with shadow prices or accounting prices or however you wish to call them. The real issue is we really can't even forwardcast what the ecosystem will be doing if left alone. So that if you want to look at your counterfactual against which you're going to be measuring interventions, the counterfactual is extremely difficult to predict. And this is, I think, something that Dr. Varucha would be better placed to tell you. Nature itself is constantly evolving, and the evolution is not linear in any sense. What tends to be more linear is the way the ecosystem will move once human intervention crops up. But the point is that that is what we are trying to evaluate. And unless we have the counterfactual first, applying the valuation rules becomes problematic on data that's being generated in real time from the ecosystem. And this is a problematic that I haven't been able to resolve intellectually.
Right, Dr. Sen. If Ms. Bhanumati would like to pose any question before Professor Dasgupta, I would like to skip my question to the end. Ms. Bhanumati, over to you. And then I would request Dr. Sen to ask, and then Professor Dasgupta may respond to both the questions together just for saving time. Ms. Bhanumati, over to you.
Thanks, Nandan. I mean, this is really an opportunity that I would like to grab. Professor Gupta, you mentioned inclusive wells, in several parts of the review. It, however, has a very limited number of parameters. I know it's a good place to start with, but then the major problem I found was that it does not seem to take into account the footprint on the global natural capital. So while keeping a tab on the natural inclusive wells may be necessary, it may not be sufficient if we really want to have a nature positive future, as Dr. Mathur was putting it. So what is your take? I mean, many of the people to whom I talk to often respond saying that the measure is actually biased towards developed countries. What's your take on this, and how can you help me answer this? Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Sen, your question before Dr. Dasgupta, if any.
Oh, so all right. Partha, let's ask again a question that I think as a policymaker we face time and again, and I'm saying this as a planner or an expert, which is that there are two major strands operating continuously in the environmental space. One are the imperatives of climate change, which are environmental in their very nature. And then there is the set of ecological issues. Right? Quite often we find that the two are actually at loggerheads. And in trying to deal with one, you may actually be making the other worse off. What would be the principles that one would use to try and resolve this kind of a conundrum?
Over to you, Professor Dasgupta.
Thank you very much. These are general but very wide-ranging questions. First of all, the issue of coordination among the local to the national to the regional and global that was first pointed out. That's always a problem. You have it. I mean, I'm going to put the question back to the economist. Imagine that we were external to nature, as is the case in most of received economic doctrine. Same question arises. There's a coordination problem. There's a problem of evaluation. But we then say, well, no, there isn't a problem in the latter because we have market prices. So markets, in some sense, coordinate the information gap. But we now, of course, we are sophisticated enough now as economists to know that that doesn't work either, because markets are absolutely dreadful in, I mean, in so many ways. Now, if you introduce nature into it, then we really fall apart. Okay. So you need, so what does one do? I'm going to add this, I'll take both sets of questions in one go. The idea of inclusive wealth is an ideal. Why are we interested in that ideal? The reason is that we know we'll never get there. We're never going to have an inclusive wealth for India or the inclusive wealth for some other country. I never said that. And the question might arise, you'd be insane to think you would go have it. But why are you then interested in it? The reason you're interested in it is it's a goal, you then work backwards from it. You work backwards because you know that you can't do it. But therefore you need to cut corners. Any applied work requires cutting corners. But you know what the corners are that you're cutting. And that's why the notion of inclusive wealth is important, because you now know what kind of errors you might, not the magnitude of the errors, but the direction of the biases. Okay. Now, I think we literally overdo it, Pranav. We really are overdoing it as hardcore economists and saying it's an impossible problem. And that in 2003, you said from 0 to you make the price infinity. If that actually did happen, then you wouldn't be in a mess. The country wouldn't be in a mess ecologically. So you didn't. You just have few objects and you said, that's a no-go area.
Yeah, few.
And of course, societies do that all the time because they place a value. I mean, a piece of ecosystem, a part of the ecosystem, maybe even a tree or a bush may have sacred value. And if it does that, you create a border around it, mental border around it. It can't be touched. And you then say, well, am I placing an infinite value? Okay, it doesn't matter what value it is, but it's not to be touched. We know about quantity constraints and as to why quantity constraints should not be seen as anti-economics, because the economics of information has told us in no uncertain terms that if you may need quantity constraints, okay, and they could range over ecosystems all the way. So what kind of data do you need? Well, you should speak to ecologists. The finance ministry ought to hire ecologists, not just filled with economists. Because you go to an ecologist, and I'll tell you one thing, the last 30 years I've spent most of my time with ecologists and not economists, because they had a heck of a lot to teach me. And these were some of the greatest ecologists on earth, by the way. So I have some sense of how they operate. They can talk about the health of an ecosystem. Okay, they get signals, they're imperfect signals, go without saying, but they will use expressions very much like the way economists or medical practitioners do. This is in a bad way. This wetland, let us say, is in a bad way. Okay, what do you do then? You ask yourself, what services you take the bottom line, which is, think of the wetland as only offering services which are of importance to us on an instrumental basis. Never mind if there is a sacred value and so forth, just ignore that. Just look at it completely as a functional object, okay? A good ecologist will tell you what services that particular ecosystem is doing. Give him some time or give her some time. And there are people around and they should be employed to inform the decision maker. And there'll be a catalog of services. What does one do then? We ask, what's the value of those services in terms of production? Remember, we're looking at it completely anthropocentrically. We're not looking at anything else, all right? So you're going to get a biased result to begin with. Let's say cleaning of water, which is helping downstream people. If it declines, what are the costs in terms of health? Or if you want to improve the water, maybe have a filtration plant, and you can cost that plant. So, I mean, this is just one example. You can go to one by one. A good, intelligent economist should, if he collaborates with an ecologist, will be able to get some ballpark figure of the value of the services the wetland is providing. Second one would be it's a habitat for birds and insects. Okay, well, in what sense are they useful? Maybe they pollinate. And if they do, what help are the farmers downstream or in the neighborhood receiving? Can you actually match that? There have been work of this kind. In fact, they're trying to value. In fact, it's very interesting. The farther the farm is from the edge of the forest, the lower the productivity, other things equal. Good econometric tests can be used to find that. All right, you got another measure, another benefit, again in terms of prices, market prices, okay? Again, imperfect. So I'm saying that it is possible at the local level to try and estimate the value of the damage to an ecosystem, your counterfactual that you were asking after. Of course, counterfactuals are required, but counterfactuals are required for even without nature. But we are blithely assume that we know how to forecast the economy without nature, just capital accumulation and human capital and produced capital. I mean, I know empirical work on growth and development as well as the next person, and they make horrific assumptions there too. So why is this particular one to be ignored? Because we are unfamiliar with it. We're unfamiliar with it because we have decided not to train ourselves with it. And in my judgment, there should be ecologists and earth scientists in every department of government. It's one of the clearest recommendations of the review, because you cannot make economic decisions without taking into account qualitative, namely, and usually qualitatively, the impact it has on. And now, of course, it's going to range enormously from ecosystem to ecosystem, project to project, goes without saying. But what does one do then? Well, a good project report will have not an appendix, a chapter, which will give the implications of the project on a variety of ecosystem services, qualitative in some case, quantitative in others. Those which you can quantify, bring them into the formal cost-benefit analysis, the rate of return computation, because that's what it should be done. And if it passes the test or rate of return, you're out laughing. If it doesn't, then you say, now we have a choice. If we ignore the qualitative issues, the project should be rejected. But on the other hand, the project which is diminishing the wetland, whereas if you take them into account, we have a zone of disagreement, possibly, or ambiguity. But ambiguity is there in every decision. I mean, to pretend that there is something uniquely given the moment we talk about nature is literally unbelievable. In health issues, I mean, currently, for example, over COVID, the government had incredibly difficult decisions to make. When to put a stop, a quantity constraint, remember, namely lockdown. Should we delay it? I mean, that's life. But let us not pretend that this is introducing such overwhelming difficulties that we ignore it. We can't ignore it. And we really need to routinize it, get familiar with it, and learn to live with ambiguity. I don't know if this makes sense, but that's the best I can do.
Dr. Dasgupta, if you want to pose a question to Ms. Bhanumati or Dr. Sen, please feel free to do so. I will ask my question much later, maybe.
No, that's fine. Actually, Pranav was on my committee, which submitted to the in 2013 on greening. So we've had these discussions.
We had these discussions before.
Right. All right.
We're still having, and this is 8 years down the road.
Okay.
Well, I don't know what's happened. Okay. Down the road, absolutely. 8 years down the road, I've really not kept up as to whether that review had any influence at all. I just don't know.
Bhanumati is leading that effort.
Good.
Yes, it did have effect, and now we are on an annual compilation. So we're just increasing the layers that we present every year. we talked about the natural resources first, and then we've started improving it by including quality concerns. And as you rightly pointed out, we have all the ecologists, hydrologists, remote sensing specialists in our team to help us do this. So, yes.
Thank you very much. That's very encouraging.
Thank
but
you.
Can I just make one final remark, which is, I should have emphasized this, but it's implicit in what I said, which is, look, inclusive wealth is out there, just we're working backwards. So when we work backwards, what is the nature of a national account that we might want to create, in addition to GDP, the usual ones, but I'm talking about now wealth accounts. The idea is to present at the end of the year, or the beginning of the year, an inventory of the nation's assets, okay? Some will be in quantitative terms, some will be in qualitative terms, and in fact, there'll be a mesh, because the extent of forest cover, what's the composition of the forest, description of it, and so forth. These are, you're describing stocks, and you're, in other words, it's an inventory accounting. Firms do that all the time. They know how many pieces of furniture they have in their factory, or number of lathes and so forth. I mean, no manager would keep his job if he doesn't know that. I mean, it goes without saying, but nations don't do that. So that's the first real message that you need, and the national accounts will be of that kind. Now, obviously, inclusive wealth means you pull them all into a scalar figure, but we've agreed that you can't get that. So you present a vector of information. So anybody can look up and see whether the state of this particular aspect of our assets, or feature of our assets, how does it compare with the previous year? Are we leaving behind a more deteriorated state of affairs in that particular component, say the wetlands or the coastal fisheries and so forth? But certainly, I don't know now, but even as only 10 years ago, it was very hard to get data on stocks of fish stocks. Countries didn't have it. Maybe they do have it now. I'm not, but I have been collaborating with those who are preparing the UNEP's inclusive wealth reports. There was one in 2012 and 14, and then 18.
Yes. And 18 is.
And they're extremely, I mean, obviously, lots of things are missing. Goes without saying. But what is necessary at this point is to give the lower bounds constantly, recognizing that you're missing out many things, okay? And that's how it's going to be. And I think in my review, I took a very anthropocentric view of nature for the most part, and very advisedly, because you need to clear that and then add any further values that you feel, intrinsic value that we feel we ought to include, or indeed communities feel there are sacred values. They should be added, goes without saying, but I don't need to tell them that. It's important to get the instrumental values as far as possible. But it's the inventory we want, and the descriptions will be in units of the ecosystems. And of course, there's another, there was an observation that was made, and we need to clear that, which is, it is a historical accident that we talk about climate change and nature. It's a historical accident because climate change got their attention, IPCC or whatever, okay? But suppose it's just a counterfactual, since Bruno likes counterfactuals. Here's a counterfactual. Suppose experts on the oceans had been very influential. Then we would have been talking about the oceans and the rest of nature. Okay, so do not think of climate change as separate. It's part of it. And the one thing I've learned from ecologists that is extremely important in my judgment is that the processes, that the rhythms of nature, as was being mentioned, are supplying these services, some of which are silent and invisible and so forth, but they're there, and on which the whole of our economy depends. These services are complementary to one another. They're not substitutes. That's extremely important. So complementarity tells us that we can't regard any one of them in isolation. And that's been the big mistake of the received economics of climate change. Somebody pointed out absolutely correctly in this venue, in the last hour, that if you there's a tension between doing something about climate change and the rest. And he's absolutely right. There is a tension. Climate change has a single metric, scalar. That's why it's very attractive. Concentration, and then a mapping from concentration to the entire climate system. Okay, but concentration for the moment. Have a lot of uncertainty. That's not, should not prevent us from thinking about climate change as being seriously problematic issue. So 1.5 degrees that we take, that's a quantitative constraint. That's a, I've never seen a more quantity constraint than that. That's exactly what it is. But in my review, the natural thing you might have thought would have been that I would build the whole of the economics of the biosphere on the back of biomass. I didn't. There's no mention of biomass as being the unit. It's the ecosystems which are the unit, because they're the ones they're supplying it. They're communities of populations. Okay. Why? Because if I started with biomass, it would have been completely wrong. Because of course I would be then saying, well, remove square mile of forest from the Amazon, and then have an equivalent amount of biomass put in the tundra, and all is well. There's no mention of biomass offsetting markets, because that would be completely wrong. The fact that these are like automobiles, well, it's not quite like automobile. Nature has complementary goods. If one of them breaks down badly, the others fall apart. So it's not like a house of cards, because nature is resilient. It's tough. It's evolved. However, the problem is we are so smart now, or we think we are so smart now, we can, if we put our mind to it, reduce nature to a house of cards. And the review has 4 chapters using evidence from the earth sciences and the ecological sciences to show that we really, globally, we are in a firefighting mode. The amount we are drawing on nature is far greater than it's capable of. So that's why in a firefighting mode, I'm very much in favor of, other things equal, having quantity constraints. We can't simply say that, look, that goes against the idea of the pricing mechanism or something.
Right. On that note, I have, sorry, Ms. Bhanumati, we are 7 minutes like ahead of the time. I am just out of time. On that note, let us move to the third session, thanking Dr. Sen and Ms. Bhanumati. We are going to move to the third session, and the third session is this. The title of this has come back, as we have heard this particular title at the very beginning and in the Professor Dasgupta's initial remarks, has to do with the practice of economics, and the practice of economics is at fault. To quote Dasgupta review, the fault is not in economics, it lies in the way we have chosen to practice it. In fact, the way that the other context that the Dasgupta review mentions in terms of finance, and that is to do with nature-related financial risk, how the central banks and financial supervisors can support in assessing the systemic extent of nature-related financial risk, and so on and so forth. In order to address these questions, we have with us Dr. Basudev Guha Khasnavis, who is presently, very recently, he has joined as the country economist of the UNDP Myanmar. And he served as senior economist with UNDP India, Nepal, and Malawi, and was associated with the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economic Research, popularly known as UNU wider. His areas of research includes informal economy, food security, and world trade. He obtained his PhD in economics from the University of Rochester, USA. With Dr. Guha Khasnavis from Myanmar, we have Mr. Niranjan Banotkar, who is the Group Chief Financial Officer of Yes Bank. He has 18 years of diverse banking experience spanning the functions of risk management, capital markets, investor relations, financial planning, and strategy. In his current position, he leads the financial management function at Yes Bank, drives its sustainable finance strategy, and is also responsible for the overall business strategy of the bank. He began his banking journey with the Bank of Bahrain and Kuwait, and has also briefly served with Ernst & Young in their risk consulting practices. So welcome Dr. Guha Khasnabis and welcome Mr. Banotkar. If you may allow, so I would like to start with posing a question before Dr. Guha Khasnabis, and it follows from what Professor Dasgupta has mentioned at towards the beginning of this webinar. Now we understand that there has been some efforts internationally in terms of embedding nature, say environmental economics or ecological economics. This is the subject that has come. So embedding nature into curriculum of economics in both undergraduate and postgraduate level. Now, in your imagination, because you have done a PhD from University of Rochester and has been associated to UNDP, for which you must be associated, or your experience requires you to interact with people from other disciplines and also sociologists, ecologists, and development practitioners. Now, if I may pose before you that in order to further embed economics into the core of embed nature into the core of economics, and that's what in language of Professor Dasgupta, changing the grammar of economics. What do you think would be the biggest challenge? Getting teachers or getting appropriate textbook or curricula? Over to you, Dr. Guha Khasnabis.
Thank you, Dr. Nahan, and good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Professor Dasgupta. It's very nice to, it's an honor for me to share the dais with you. Coming to your question, Dr. Nahan, very relevant one. In fact, you know, my professional career is a blend of academic, teaching at various institutes plus my stint with the UN. So I do, when I'm with a university, I do keep getting books, sample books from publishers on a whole range of economic issues, but I cannot recall seeing a very rigorous textbook on environmental economics. Now, that's not saying that there doesn't exist any such books. Maybe it hasn't come to my desk. So credible textbooks and motivated teachers, as you said, are both necessary. I would like to believe that they exist. If the textbooks are credible or the teachers are passionate and truly motivated is a little subjective, so let me not go into that. The point I wish to emphasize here is that we also need motivated students. Now, to me, the problem here lies in the incentives created by the development pathway we have followed in the past 40 to 50 years. The youth, say people belonging to the age of 18 to 24, they see better paying job opportunities if they have the conventional neoclassical, technical, and quantitative economic skills rather than environmental economics. It is a fact, an unfortunate fact that exists. Now, why is this the case? I think this takes us back to the universal emphasis on unqualified GDP growth. It is only in the past 15 to 20 years that, or 10 to 15 years, that we are starting to question the trickle-down effect on growth to address issues like, say, inequality. But environmental concerns, unfortunately, remained a relatively, for lack of a better word, a soft subject or a soft concern in the macroeconomic policy discourse for a very, very long time. Now, as a result, the so-called market economy has not priced environment in a way that it priced or keeps pricing, say, sophisticated consumer goods, new car models, new smartphones, and you name it. Now, this pricing distortion, I think, prevented or is still preventing a deeper mainstreaming of environmental issues into business, with few exceptions here and there. To put it in another way, an employer generally gives preference to a candidate who has a strong quantitative and technical skill in economics rather than a degree on environmental economics. At least there is a significant salary gap between the two. So unless incentives are created in the job market, the demand for textbooks and teachers on environmental economics will probably continue to take a back seat. Now, having stated the problem the way I see it, there is one possible way forward, which I have been thinking for a while now, having spent some time in one of the IITs teaching economics, for example. One possible way forward is for the social sciences and the technological institutes to speak to each other a bit more than they seem to be doing currently. For example, most of our IITs have an incubation lab or an innovation lab these days. And some of them come up with some very good innovative solutions to address a local or a regional environmental issue. Now, the next step, now after coming up with that gadget or with that tool, they are not very sure of what is the way forward. The next step obviously is to be able to sell it to the private sector to give it scale so that everybody can actually adopt it and actually use it to the benefit of the environment. Now, this is where I think an economics or a management institute can step in to provide a business model. If such interactions start to happen on a regular basis between our technological institutes and our social science institutes, I feel we will start seeing more textbooks and teachers and a more robust curriculum of environmental economics, which can bridge the gap between the two, which still exists.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Guha Khasnavis. Let me change gear and from economics to let me move to finance. And that is, I would like to place this question before you, Mr. Banotkar, is that we have seen a narrative that is going on in delivering nature and biodiversity goals, that we know that. And there is a change in this narrative that is happening. Your association with this global financial services or financial sector as such, do you see that global financial sector adapting to this changing narrative? For that matter, within the Indian context, if you just focus, because after all, we are all focusing on this Indian local context, what would be your take on, say, inherent opportunities or barriers that, or for that matter, innovation that we need to mobilize finance for nature? That will be over to you, Dr. Banotkar. Not been able to hear you. Can you speak now? No, we are not been able to hear you. There is an issue in your mic then. No, I'm not been able to hear you. When you take care of that, let me pose a question to Professor Dasgupta. This is follows from Dr. Guha Khasnavis. And this was this, that if, say, you have been given this, you have to choose a team of authors who need to rewrite the text. Mr. Banotkar, let me finish up. If you have to choose a team of authors to rewrite textbooks in order to change the grammar of economics, I'm sure I agree with you that it's required, and I suppose both of us agree that this is very difficult job also. So if I may ask you, how will you find out these people that who are willing to devote that time to actually rewrite the grammar of economics? Yeah.
And then are you asking me?
Yes.
Oh, I see. Gosh, it's a difficult problem because in the language of game theory, we are in a what Dr. Vasudev was pointing to absolutely correctly. We're in a bad Nash equilibrium. There's no incentive on a single department to make a move in that direction. So the really good ecological economists, their exceptions, of course, are not in economics departments, but are in environmental schools, geography departments, and so forth. Okay, so that's one of the things we have to live with it. I have no magic wand as to how it's to be done. It's a sad reflection of, it's a bad, as I say, bad natural equilibrium. And much is being written about this, by the way, at the moment. But I'd like to use one example to both meet what Dr. Basudeb was pointing to, and the next question, which is, suppose we have all these missing markets. Okay, we're agreed on that. Now, it so happens, not accidentally, that the seat of the richest biodiversity is in the tropics. Okay, and it so also happens that the tropics house the poorest countries in the world. All right, so these are the empirical observations. Now, they're the suppliers of primary products, primary goods, which are shipped, and processed, and shipped, and so forth, and eventually find their way into supermarkets in, say, UK, US, or whatever, or Europe in general. I'm talking a prototypical case. Now, of course, there are many other sorts of. Now, if there are missing markets in the primary product zone, and ecosystems are being degraded because they're not being taken into account in the commercial profitability of the project, and then they're exported. We know one consequence, which is the export price is an underrepresentation of the accounting value of the export product, which is another way of saying that there is a wealth transfer from the exporting country to the importing country, which is another way of saying that the poor countries have been subsidizing the growth of the rich countries. Now, this is not an anti-capitalist, this is not a political statement or anything. It's an logical implication of the fact that there are missing markets, rampant missing markets, if you like, in primary products. All right, so 50 years ago, a company which has its primary product source in a particular ecosystem could say, if it dries up, quote unquote, in other words, it deteriorates, I can move elsewhere. Today, it's becoming more difficult because it's become too crowded. So it's in the interest, the longer interest of the company to ensure that the source doesn't dry up. Source doesn't dry up means it doesn't collapse. The ecosystem doesn't collapse. All right. Now, counter argument is that company directors have a 5-year time horizon. Who cares what happens in 20 years' time, and so forth. So that's always been there. Okay, there's a myopia in the private decision making. How do you take the long run into account? I think the one thing, and I've had many discussions in the last 4 months since the review was published. Many, literally dozens with financiers in the banking sector, production sector, and so forth. And they say, well, no, it is important because we may want to make a first mover advantage by building up a good reputation. Now that suggests that one of the things that's required is really that citizens ought to demand. There's a lot of moral hazard issues here. Remember, we are consuming products whose history we do not know. Now, in the health case, of course, we do care, and that's why when you buy health, food products these days in supermarkets, at least in England, you get a huge huge number of information about the food, fat content, the salt content, the sugar content, and so on. Why? Because there's a moral hazard problem. You don't know what you're buying, and so you insist that they disclose it, and backed by the rule of law, that if they actually lie, they can be taken to court. Likewise, if we care about that's why the citizen is important here, because we could demand that firms disclose the entire supply chain, what's going on in their supply chain, treatment of the ecosystems and so forth. Now, what's the advantage of that? If all firms are required to do that, they will have bigger profits than they would in the national equilibrium that we're looking at. Okay, which is, all right. So it's in the interest of firms, in fact, to collaborate now and demand that there's legislation to make them disclose. This is again another quantity control solution to a massive failure on the price system. Okay, because it's disclosing information which the consumer now demands. Now, firms at the moment think that consumers might demand that in 15, 20 years' time. Hence, there's an advantage of being first to move. But it carries with it a risk, huge risk, because you're paying the price now and you don't know whether the consumer taste will change and so forth, and whether the value of your reputation is high enough, that you can create reputation as a capital asset for the firm. So collective action may be the right thing. And the people I've talked to have insisted that, yes, they recognize that. And so the rate of returns that they will be estimating will be based on a projection into the future of a recognition that firms will all be having to disclose what happened in the entire supply chain, protecting the supply source from erosion. So there are ways by which we can, through legislation, bring the profitability calculation of private companies, and profitability including nature, of private companies, aligned with the incentives for promoting the common good. I don't know if this makes sense.
Yes, it does. It does. Let me request Mr. Banotkar to respond. I think we'll be able to hear you now. Over to you, Mr. Banotkar.
Hi. Sorry about the weird technical glitch. Yes, thank you, Professor Nandan. It's indeed a pleasure to be interacting today with all the eminent speakers. Also on behalf of Yes Bank, I would like to thank all of you for your participation and thank you for very insightful session that we've had so far. Special compliments to Professor Dasgupta for the landmark review, which I'm sure is going to play a pivotal role in mobilizing collective action and driving progress towards protecting the natural environment. Most importantly, I think these discussions are quite timely. To be honest, maybe a tad late in the sense that we need to ramp up efforts for a resilient recovery from we've seen that from the pandemic, but also accelerate our transition to a greener economy at the same time. Biodiversity, as we know, underpins all economic activity, with more than half of the world's GDP moderately to highly dependent on ecosystem services. And given the massive contribution of biodiversity in propelling growth, it is an alarming situation that world's ecosystems have declined by 47%. Right? So while this continued degradation represents an annual loss of approximately 480 billion USD, nature positive transitions, on the other hand, actually could generate more like 10 trillion USD in annual business value, create close to 4 million jobs, and this is all part of the World Economic Forum, discussions that we've had, that these could create jobs by 2030. And therefore, as we enter the decade of action, joint efforts are needed to tackle the dual emergency of not only climate but also the nature degradation, and to Professor Dasgupta's comments, not necessarily look at this separately but as one subject, to help build economies, build back better. Globally, if you look at the financial sector, 55 financial institutions representing over 9 trillion euros in assets have signed up for Finance for Biodiversity pledge. There's a network for greening financial system. NGFS has launched a working group on biodiversity. The Dutch and the UK central banks have started to consider the relevance of non-climate environmental risks to financial stability. There is launch of the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, which should allow the financial institutions and companies to incorporate nature-related risks and opportunities into decision-making. This rapid traction on nature and biodiversity protection could partially be attributed to the groundwork already done to address climate action, but clearly the attention needs a lot more focus here. Certainly, global progress towards nature positive outcomes will play a key role in setting the stage for financial sector in emerging economies like India to quickly adapt to this changing narrative, right? And despite the increasing momentum, the State of Finance for Nature report actually pegs the financing gap at approximately $4 trillion USD till 2050, with only 14% of the nature-related finance coming in from the private sector. Zooming in from the global context to India, one of the estimates suggests that the country is spending approximately 2 billion annually towards biodiversity conservation. However, the requirements actually, the range is quite wide, anywhere between 15 to 45 billion USD. So going forward, the coherence of biodiversity and ecosystem related policies and cross-stakeholder collaboration really is going to decide the speed of on-ground action. Regulatory interventions in the form of national biodiversity targets, national mission on biodiversity and human well-being, adoption of the system of environmental economic accounting, which is the SEEA, will continue to provide guidance on the national focus areas and priority geographies. Leveraging these policies, financial institutions need to act fast and embed biodiversity considerations in the decision making from a risk return perspective. Again, something that we briefly spoke about in the earlier question that Professor Dasgupta responded to. But there are certain barriers that inhibit financial institutions to fully integrate natural capital considerations. And some of that, I mean, I just wanted to bring that out. One is there is a limited understanding of the nature related risks and the opportunities. There's absence of clear definitions and a national policy on sustainable finance with a very specific focus on nature intensive sectors. Again, there is a need to have a step-by-step guide to integrate nature considerations into investment decision making. Again, it's something that some work needs to be done. Limited availability of data and tools to simulate nature-based scenarios. And most importantly, what we're also seeing is that India is still recovering from the challenges posed by COVID, right, which has significantly impacted FI. So navigating through these existing uncertainties and managing the stakeholder expectations is already keeping financial institutions on their toes, right? So I just also thought it's important that we bring this out when we look at the challenges. But to kind of address some of these challenges, we can actually look at some of the following key aspects in terms of how we can integrate. So firstly, expanding the ESG frameworks to incorporate nature-related risks, again, to the point that has already been discussed, right? Now, whether it is in terms of conducting due diligence or active engagement with your clients to improve performance, defining specific metrics or targets. So just to give you an example, so we have an environmental and social assessment policy where, very clearly when we assess these risks for our customers, we do look at land use change, water withdrawal, for particular sectors and geography. So that's one of the instances that we look at. Similarly, there is a scorecard in the policy wherein biodiversity is actually a screening factor when we are assessing corporate credit. But the point is that I think this needs to be across the financial institutions, and there needs to be a consistent framework that needs to be adopted by all the financial institutions. Secondly, there needs to be a proactive approach to fund sectors like sustainable agriculture, forestry, fishery, through blended finance, credit enhancements, or CSR grants. And again, I think we can talk a lot about this, but there can be regulatory intervention. Government can participate in terms of just expanding the scope, right?
Right.
Sorry.
No, I was just wondering whether, because we have roughly 4 minutes time, so would Dr. Guha Khasnaviz would like to pose a question to Professor Dasgupta, and then I'll come back to you, Mr. Banotkar, if you want to ask a question to Professor Dasgupta.
Sure.
Thank you. A very quick question, Professor Dasgupta, and this is entirely as a UNDP person. I hope you have seen our latest Human Development Report, where we came up with a new concept called the planetary HDI, where what we have done there is, the conventional HDI has 3 components: health, income, and education. So the income component has been modified by taking into account the carbon footprint, the CO2 emission, and the material footprint of achieving that level of GDP. So when we do that, when we re-rank the countries according to the PHDI, we see a considerable reshuffling of the rankings. The countries which belong to the high HDI group fall way below. They lose almost 50 ranks. They go down the ranking system. So an initiative like this, do you think it's a step in the right direction to nudge people, nations towards, that we are monitoring you now, please act in a responsible manner?
Well, thank you very much. No, I'm sorry, I didn't, the review took up all my time for a year and a half, and it was released only in February, as you know. So I haven't had the opportunity of reading your thing, but the way you describe it seems absolutely right, the right way to nudge. I wouldn't personally go in that route of modifying the HDI for reasons that my review makes clear, but that's not the issue. What you're asking is something else, which is it a way of nudging governments to recognize the significance of nature? And that probably is the case. I should say one thing which has gone through my mind right through these last two sessions has that there's been a kind of a sense of despair or dismissal of the issues because they're so difficult to measure. And I think that is very unfortunate. And it's unfortunate because we are unfamiliar with that. Our training as social scientists and economists is so geared that it looks like a fiendishly impossible problem. And it's not. It's very difficult, that's for sure. It's not. It's simply because we don't converse with the scientists who actually work on these fields. So they have some sense of the productivity of these assets, okay? And this is particularly to Dr. Vasudev, because there's no text in the sense that you're mentioning. You're quite right, probably. At least I also haven't found in a sense. But then a good teacher shouldn't depend on the existence of a catechism. There's huge amount of good work that's been done by ecological economists. Nandan himself is part of an extremely rich academic pursuit that's going on in India now. It's a new journal, and it should be mandatory for economists to read it, but they won't. And I mean, I know that because from experience, every time we've tried it, there is a journal called Environment and Development Economics. Lots of very good work has been done in South Asia. Very good work has been done, empirical work in Africa, Latin America, because there are networks that as it happened, I helped to create, one of them being Sandy. Extremely important, very powerful work has come out of there, empirical work, okay? Relevant to exactly what we've been discussing. They do not get cited anywhere except in my review. And in fact, I've been bent backwards to ensure that they get referred to. So the citations from South Asia are huge. For the simple reason that the very, very good work has taken place by people in unknown universities or unprominent universities of South Asia and Africa and Latin America. We forget there is a huge amount of work that's already been done. Then there are collections of essays, which Sandy has produced two marvelous collections, one on common property resources and one on valuation, okay, of ecosystem services. And both of them are, one is from Cambridge University Press, the other is from Oxford University Press. And if you look at my review, you'll find ample illustrations of their findings in boxes and in text. A good teacher should be collating that and producing it, preparing a course out of it. We shouldn't have necessarily a pedagogic step. That will come too. So I think it's extremely important to recognize that this is not an impossible problem. Some years ago, Markandeya and Murthy, both Indian economists, produced a marvelous piece of work with all its defects of doing a social cost benefit analysis of cleaning up the Ganges. I mean, a massive, massive piece of work, okay? Now, they showed that the rate of return, taking a minimal rate of return, is extremely high, 10 to 12%, okay? Now, how did they do that? They looked at the consequences of the pollution. health consequences, productivity consequences in terms of agricultural productivity and so forth. There's a lot of data out there. Now, all of this is approximate, goes without saying. So is it when you estimate a steel industry or a dam. Think of dams, ghastly objects, and yet we produce them like crazy. So we shouldn't be in despair. And we like to throw up our hands because we are unfamiliar with the area. And that brings me back to Vasudev's question, which is absolutely right. There is no obvious text and no economics department wants to teach it. And it's a bad Nash equilibrium, and we know that it's very hard to dislodge a system from a bad Nash equilibrium, goes without saying. But there is a lot of stuff out there if you want it, and a lot of it is being done in India itself. And finally, I was amazing, really encouraged by what I've heard about what's going on in the work in this area in India. I mean, it's just been remarkable. I wasn't aware of it. The minute in detail of the teaching side and the restoration side, very, very nice indeed. But as I said, we need more ecologists engaging with economists, or rather the overture should come from us to them so that we can work together and make these problems more doable.
Right. May I revert back to Mr. Banutkar if you would like to pose a question to Professor Dasgupta, and that will be the last question. With that response from Professor Dasgupta, we'll close this session.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Nandan. It's an honor to be on the same screen with Professor Dasgupta. So thank you for that. I'll keep my question short. What do you think should be the first thing that needs to be done to ensure to truly align the financial systems of the future to nature-based outcomes? What do you think is the most critical aspect that needs to be undertaken first?
Gosh, there's so many of them that I'll just give you one. The most important probably is a vector. Okay, so there's several, but let me just go to one, which is a sort of pet of mine now, and I'm trying to sell the idea. It's not going to work, at least not in my lifetime. We have COP25, COP26 and COP15 coming up, and there is no mention in any of the discussion of the need for a new international institution like the World Bank or the IMF to monitor and manage the global commons, the oceans, for example, which are open access resources, and transport, fisheries, transport mainly, and then also on top of that, of course, now the threat of mining in the deep seas. Okay, somebody has to be involved in it. We haven't had the boldness. I think the world community now is not as bold as people were at the end of the Second World War, when countries were on their knees and the World Bank was instituted. IMF was constituted because they could supply certain global public goods, reconstruction and development on the one hand and financial stability on the other. We now have a world in which, and it's coming to the private sector because that's an aspect of it, they need the signals. And they are not getting the signals because these commons are free goods. Nobody's paying a rent for it. Now imagine that you had an institution which had the authority to charge for the transport that we enjoy across the Pacific and the Atlantic, all the goods, trillions of tons of goods that are exported. That revenue could be huge, and it belongs to the world community, all right? Because these are common property resources, nobody owns them, all right? And that could be used for God knows how many things, never mind poverty alleviation, but compensation to countries which house global public goods like the tropical rainforest. They need compensation because they're supplying a public good if they want to preserve it. They're supplying a global public good, but they are the ones who are carrying the burden, quote unquote, okay? Because they'll say, we could have plantations, we could have beef farms and so forth, which they do. And meanwhile, of course, the rainforests are shrinking. So we need that. And if you did that, then of course the pricing structure would change enormously. And if we could raise the rents from the commons, we could compensate the countries which house commons as well. I mean, public goods, and have some finances left over. Very crude calculations. I mean, the crudest possible tells me that the revenue that can be generated from the global commons is literally gigantic. I mean, you could, I mean, you wouldn't believe it. We're looking at literally trillions and trillions of dollars, but it's for free. So I think we need institutional changes. And of course, I could give you a retinue of institutional changes going down to the local level, some of which we've already covered in this review, on this occasion. But we do need institutional changes because those are doable in principle. And once you have the institutions, then of course the pricing mechanism starts coming in, or quantity controls, doesn't matter. I mean, that's a different matter. You could have protected zones too, which is another way of saying we have quantity constraints. But we do need management. And as of now, the commons, these massive public goods are unmanaged, and that's not right.
On this note, I declare the closure of session 3. I make 3 comments actually, and then I will request Professor Dasgupta to offer his final remarks. First comment is that the journal that Professor Dasgupta mentioned, the name is Ecology, Economy and Society, the EC journal, of which I was the managing editor, and Professor Dasgupta serves in his advisory board. The second is the program with which I am associated with. It's the MSc Economics program with a specialization in environmental resource economics at Terry School of Advanced Studies. And there are 3 courses called Environment and Economic Development, Natural Resource Economics, and Environment Economics are core papers, not an optional papers. And the last, of course, is that we are at the National Mission on Biodiversity and Human Well-Being. Economics of Ecological Restoration is a matter that is covered by 2 programs, and that indeed is my present research area. And as Professor Dasgupta has already said, this is the most challenging area precisely because of data, because of models, because of methods, because nothing exists, in fact. So we are going in for that. In other words, it's something that we need to do, irrespective of the fact that United Nations declared this decade as the decade for ecological restoration. But it is important to change the grammar of economics. On that, my limited scope will be on the economics of ecological restoration. Hopefully in a year's time, I'll be able to show you something, Professor Dasgupta. Over to you for the final remarks.
No, I think I don't have any final remarks to make. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to be with you. And Nandan, I can't tell you how impressed I am in the way you have organized it and shared it. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. May I request Dr. Ravi Chellam to offer a vote of thanks? Over to you, Ravi.
Thanks, Nandan. Thanks, everybody. Good evening. I propose a vote of thanks on behalf of the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, National Biodiversity Authority, UNDP, Campaign for Nature, S-Bank, and the Biodiversity Collaborative. Institutions which collaborated to organize this engaging discussion on ideas and actions which are so vitally needed for the overall welfare of humanity, especially in a post-pandemic world. We thank everyone who's shown interest and made the time to attend this event. We sincerely hope that this marks only the beginning of a much longer and deeper engagement on these issues, which require all our attention and collective action. We're extremely grateful to Professor Partha Dasgupta for readily agreeing to share his knowledge and wisdom, as well as spending more than 2 hours with all of us. A thanks to all the speakers and discussants, Dr. Mathur, Madam Umadevi, Dr. Chong Shimre, Dr. Eresh Barusha, Dr. Pranab Sen, Madam Bhanumati, Dr. Basudev Guha Kasnovis, and Mr. Niranjan Banodkar. Not to forget Professor Nandan Nan, who moderated the conversation. This event has been on our minds soon after the reviews published in February this year. We are really glad that we've been able to conduct it today. It has taken the collective efforts of many people to make it happen. In particular, I would like to thank the Office of the PSA, Government of India, for their support to the Biodiversity Collaborative, Dr. Harun Mohammed and Rebecca Gray of the Treasury Department, Government of UK, Arnesh Sharma and Anjali Gupta of S-Bank, Ruchi Pant and Parth Joshi of UNDP India, Dhruv Gangadharan, Gautam Godavan, Namrata Murli, and Tirath Rawat of the Biodiversity Collaborative. Take care, stay safe. Bye-bye.